Hi, good evening, everybody. Now we will continue with the second part of reproduction in plants. Okay, over here, what we see previously, we are comparing between self-pollination versus cross-pollination. Now, over here, we will be comparing between insect pollination versus wind pollination. Now, this is another very important segment, and it's a commonly asked question where the exam will actually ask what's the difference between an insect pollinated plant versus a wind pollinated plant. Some other examples of questions they can test you using this concept is basically they give you a picture of a flowering plant, and you from the features in the picture you are required to identify the mode of pollination in the flower. Is it wind or is it insect? Okay. So over here, these are the different parts of an insect pollinated flower. So far, there's not a lot of question that requires you to label this part of the insect pollinated flower. However, we can actually take a look at how the flower could actually be considered as an insect pollinated flower. So number one, the calyx will consist of green sepals, and this actually helps to form the base. And this base of the calyx is usually enclosed by an epicalyx that consists of two leaves. The corolla will consist of 5 brightly colored petals that helps to attract insects. So one key thing to take note is this area where the petals are brightly colored to attract insect. So this is one way you can identify whether is it an insect pollinated flower. Now in this case, right, if let's say the picture they give you is in black and white, then you cannot use this as an answer to describe the flower being an insect pollinated flower. But this is something that you can actually give, whereby the standard petals, right, will actually contain nectar guides. Nectar guides are what we can see through the diagram, lines, guiding lines. And these guiding lines actually are what we call nectar guides, in which it helps to guide the insect towards the into the stigma that for them to be able to deposit the pollen grains. And in this case, right, there are two deep blue wing petals that are enclosed by the standard petals, and that this helps to actually later on you will take a look how it's able to actually rub against the body of the insect to release the pollen grains onto the stigma. Sometimes it helps to protect the inner side of the stigma to prevent any form of self-pollination. And of course, you have two yellowish green neem petals enclose the reproductive organs of the flower. So for an insect pollinated flower, what we can see is the endorsement, which is the male reproductive organ of the flower, tend to consist of 10 stamens that have very long filaments. Now these filaments, right, are then fused to form a trough that enclose the pistil, and then the nectar of the flowers tend to collect at the bottom of this stamen trough. Hence, they can only be reached by the insects with their very long tubular mouth, which is the proboscis. So what it means, right, is that the insect would actually have to move further into the flower in order to actually reach out to gain the nectar and then to deposit maybe their pollen grains. So the pistil consists of a single couple, and then the stigma is small and compact. This is another feature that you can use to describe that there's an insect pollinated flower, because the stigma tends to be very, very hidden inside the flower and not really protruding out of the plant, unlike the wind pollinated flower. The style can be long and have very curly, hairy structure. This helps to aid to brush off the body of the insect to release the pollen grains onto the flower. The ovary is long and narrow with a single row of ovules. So in this case, right, how would then the insect pollinate the flower? First, the insect would actually have to land on the standard petal, which tends to be very large and conspicuous. Conspicuous means that you can actually see it or it is very obvious. Now, these petals tend to be also large in order to be able to support the weight of the insect. So generally, the insect will then follow the nectar guides into the flower, and in order to collect the nectar, the insect will force its way between the two wing petals. These will then result in the insect body, right, the back, right, to force the knee petals upwards to expose the anther and the stigma. But more importantly, it helps in the form of like for the pollen grains from the anthers to stick to the back of the insect and get transferred to the stigma. So that's one way. And after that, the insect would then leave the flower, where the new petals will then spring back to its original position to protect the pollen grains and the stigma. So this will also allow time for the insect to deposit the pollen grains onto another flower using the same fashion. So over at this part is either number one, you receive the pollen grain from this flower, or you can actually at the same time deposit any of the pollen grains that they received from the previous flower that they visited. Next, we look at wind pollinated flower. For wind pollinated flower, one very interesting thing you can see is that it has actually a very large feathery kind of your star or stigma over here, where it helps to like act as a sweeping motion to trap any pollen grains that actually is being received from the wind or from the air. Your stamens, which is indicated in red, right? This red portion here, or this, they tend to be dangling out of the flower so as to release the pollen grain easily um, into the surrounding and to be carried away by the air. The pollen grains for any wind pollinated flower, right, tends to be very light and feathery such that it is able to have some form of buoyancy in order to float around the leaf. Whereas the pollen grains for insect pollinated flower, they tend to be hairy or have hair hook-like structures to hook onto the body of the insect. So generally, this is how it looks like. And we can see that for this particular area, it's actually more of a bisexual flower. Bisexual flower means that it contains both the male and the female reproductive organs within the same flower. So when they are ready to reproduce, the lodisters will actually swell and force the two flowering bracket apart, resulting in the pollen grains to actually splash outwards. And the lower male flower will contain only three stamens with long filaments and two lodicers. For for all these, you can actually read for your own knowledge, but generally, you would need to be able to express what are some of the characteristics of the flower that actually leads it to be a wind pollinated flower. Secondly, it might also be the pollen grains, the characteristics of the pollen grains. For an exam, they can show you a picture of it and you are required to identify it. So for mature stamens, they have long filaments that hang downwards and can be and they can be swing pendulously freely. So this is what we call pendulous. Pendulous is more for like like a pendulum where you can actually swing left to right, so something of that nature. And when the filaments sway, the pollen is then shaken free and carried away by the wind. Mature stigma is also large and it extended and feathery to provide a large surface area in order to capture any pollen grain that actually is available in the air. So this is two main things that you can use for in terms of structure for wind pollinated flower. This one I would strongly advise you to remember, as this is generally one area of exam that allows you to identify it. So like for example, having large brightly colored petals, you can use the word conspicuous to replace the word brightly colored for insect pollinated flower. Whereas for wind, it tends to be smaller, dull in color because there is no need to attract insect, neither does it need to actually support the weight of the insect at the petal. Nectar is absent in a wind pollinated flower, whereas in an insect pollinated flower, it tends to be present. Scent, you can't really smell scent from your paper, but in biopractical, if let's say in exam they give you a flower and you do smell some fragrant or sweet smelling flower, that could be another indication of it being an insect pollinated flower. Okay, the stigma, which is very obvious, tends to be small and compact and do not protrude out of the flower, whereas for wind, it can be large, feathery, and protrude out of the flower. Adding on, your stamens are not pendulums and do not protrude out of the flower, whereas for wind, they tend to be very long and pendulous, that means swing around with the anthers protruding. This allows more of the pollen grain to escape. Pollen grain, because it's fairly abundant, meaning there's still a lot, but not as much as the wind pollinated flower, because these insect, right, they are more targeted to which of the flower species to land. As compared to wind, you are really dependent on nature to actually carry it far away. So pollen grains are also larger and have rough surface. Mainly they have hair like hook structures to help to hook onto the insect body to be transported easily. Whereas for wind pollinated, they tend to have more of a flatter surface, have wing-like structures to carry the pollen grains easily. And they are of course tiny and more abundant. Nectar guides will be present for insect pollinated flower, and wind pollinated flower would be, the nectar guides will be absent. So these are generally the main ideas. So how would a question be raised? They can give you a picture. And from the picture, they will ask you to identify, is it a wind and insect or insect pollinated flower based on the structures. The follow-up on this is they will ask you to compare the seed. They can also ask you to identify the male reproductive organs of the flower or female reproductive organs and ask the functions. Eventually, they can even lead to how fertilization occurs after they talk about pollination. So lastly, we talk about fertilization, where this usually comes out as an essay component where you are required to describe the growth of the pollen grain, of the pollen tube, and its entry into the ovule followed by fertilization. Now, fertilization is not pollination, whereas pollination is more on the act of the pollen grain being landed onto the stigma. Whereas fertilization, we are talking more like how the male gamete from the pollen grain is able to fuse with the female gamete from the ovum or the ovary. So in this case, right, fertilization, that's what is involved. So after pollination, pollen grain will first germinate in response to the sugary fluid secreted by the mature stigma. This will cause the pollen grain to actually open up to release that generative nucleus as well as the pollen tube nucleus. So the pollen tube nucleus will grow out from the pollen grain, and this growth is mainly controlled by the pollen tube nucleus that comes from the pollen grain. So the pollen tube is generally eating up more of the style of the stigma, and this one it actually flows even downwards to the ovary. So the cytoplasm and two nuclei will pass into the pollen tube, and the pollen tube will then secrete enzymes to digest the surrounding tissue of the stigma and style. So you can see the pollen grain is here, and then later on it will form the pollen tube all the way down into this area called the micropyle. So the opening of where the pollen tube will enter into the ovule is the micropyle, and the generative nucleus will then slowly divide into two male gametes, in which the pollen tube nucleus will then slowly disintegrate. Why? Because it has served its purpose to generate the pollen tube. So when the pollen tube reaches the ovule, its tip will absorb the sap and burst, releasing the two male gametes. During fertilization, one of the male gametes, because initially you have two, right? One of it will fuse with the ovum to form the zygote, whereas the other male gamete will fuse with the definitive nucleus to form the endosperm. This endosperm nucleus is generally a food source for the whole seedling. So the zygote will then slowly divide and develop into the embryo, and the endosperm nucleus will give rise to an endosperm. So more or less, because as a seed, right, you don't have any leaf, you don't have any root, so you will need some form of food source for the seed to actually take in order to keep on growing until the roots and the stem and the first leaf actually is being produced. Because seeds are underground, and when they're underground, there's no light, exposure to light, and therefore they cannot undergo photosynthesis. So after fertilization, this one can come as an MCQ. The eventual pathway of how it will change is the ovule will become the seed. The ovary will actually slowly develop into the fruit, and the zygote will develop into the embryo. So when the seed germinates, this embryo will develop into a new plant. So generally, that's all for reproduction in plants, and see you in the next chapter. Thank you.